They said silence was surrender, that walking away from hundreds of millions meant she'd won. But Nathaniel Sterling knew better. 23 years building an empire from basement offices and overnight coding sessions had taught him one unshakable truth: the loudest victories were often the emptiest ones. And Charlotte Ashford, standing in that courtroom with her Hermes bag and her fresh humiliation, was about to learn what real silence sounded like. The December air bit through his Brioni suit as Nate stepped onto the courthouse steps, photographers forming a wall of flashing light. Behind him, the limestone columns of the Southern District Courthouse rose like monuments to institutional memory. Every bankruptcy, every fraud case, every marriage dissolved by greed had passed through those doors. Now, his name would join the record. Not as a criminal, as a man who'd worn coveralls for 3 years just to see if anyone could love him without a net worth attached. The Rolls-Royce Phantom idled at the curb, exhaust rising in white plumes. Franklin Pierce, his attorney, moved beside him with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd shepherded hundreds of clients through media storms. But Franklin's usual poker face had cracked. The slight upturn at his mouth said everything they'd just witnessed, something rare. Not justice. Justice was too clinical a word. Reckoning, maybe. The universe's accounting department finally balancing its books. A reporter thrust a microphone toward his face. The woman wore the desperate hunger of someone chasing a viral clip. "Mr. Sterling, why did you hide your wealth from your wife?" Nate stopped. The question hung between them, framed by the cold in the crowd and the weight of 14 months' worth of assumptions. He could have kept walking. Should have, probably. Franklin's hand on his elbow suggested exactly that. But there were moments when silence required punctuation, and this was one of them. His voice carried across the stone plaza without effort. "I didn't hide anything. My name was always Nathaniel Sterling. The hospital where I worked, where I still work, has that name carved above the entrance in 3-foot letters. Google is free. Curiosity costs nothing." Charlotte chose comfort over questions, and that was her decision, not my deception. He turned toward the Rolls-Royce before the follow-ups could land. Franklin slid in beside him, and the door closed with the kind of engineered whisper that cost 6 figures to perfect. The driver pulled into traffic without instruction, already knowing the route back to Teterboro, then the 40-minute flight to Boston, then home to a penthouse she'd never seen because she'd never asked where he actually lived. Franklin exhaled long and slow, the sound of a man releasing 3 years of professional restraint. "That was the most beautiful legal proceeding I've witnessed in 30 years of practice." Nate watched Manhattan scroll past the window. Lunch crowds spilled from office buildings, everyone chasing the next meeting, the next deadline, the next rung up a ladder that never quite reached anywhere meaningful. He'd climbed that ladder once, built Sterling Medical Holdings from a single struggling community hospital in Dorchester into 52 facilities across 12 states. The climb had cost him everything the first time Abigail wrapped her Mercedes around an oak tree doing 90 in a 40 because she'd been racing another trophy wife to prove whose husband bought the faster car. His daughter Grace had been 5. Now she was 28, a cardiothoracic surgeon with steadier hands than her father had ever possessed. She'd watched him bury her mother, then watched him disappear into work for 2 years until the grief dulled enough to function. Then she'd watched him meet Charlotte at a hospital gala and do something that looked insane from the outside but made perfect sense to anyone who'd lost someone to the disease of wanting more. The phone in his pocket buzzed. Grace's name lit the screen, followed by 3 words, "I'm watching CNN." He texted back, and her response came immediately. "Dad, you broke Twitter. #Janitor Billionaire is #1 worldwide. There are memes, so many memes." Franklin leaned over, reading the screen uninvited. "Your daughter has excellent timing." The phone buzzed again, this time a screenshot. Charlotte's face frozen mid-sob outside the courthouse mascara tracking down her cheeks. The Post's headline, already drafted in bold, sans serif: "She divorced the janitor, he owned the hospital." Nate locked the screen and pocketed the device. The satisfaction people expected him to feel wasn't there. just a hollow kind of tired, the exhaustion of a test finally completed after years of false starts and recalibrated variables. Charlotte had failed. Preston Whitmore, the Goldman Sachs managing director who'd whispered, "fucking janitor," while kissing another man's wife, had failed. Her father Montgomery, who'd offered Nate a junior acquisitions role like he was rescuing a drowning puppy, had failed. But failure was just data. It didn't require celebration, only acknowledgement. The Gulfstream waited on the tarmac exactly where he'd left it 90 minutes earlier. $75 million of composite materials and Rolls-Royce engines capable of flying 14 passengers to Tokyo without refueling. Today, it carried two himself and Franklin. The pilots, Captain Morrison, no relation, and First Officer Hayes had the pre-flight complete before Nate reached the stairs. Franklin settled into one of the cream leather recliners, already pulling files from his briefcase. "We should discuss next steps. Charlotte's attorney will likely try to spin this claim you committed fraud by omission." Nate raised a hand. The gesture was slight but absolute. "There are no next steps. The judge denied her petition. The divorce decree stands. Charlotte signed away her claims 14 months ago, and Massachusetts law doesn't care that she didn't read the fine print on my tax bracket." The jet engines spooled up that particular whine of controlled combustion that always sounded like possibility condensed into physics. Through the window, a Delta 737 lumbered down the adjacent taxiway, packed with 200 people eating peanuts and watching recycled sitcoms on seatback screens. Nate had flown commercial exactly once in the last decade, a red-eye to Seattle for the hospital acquisition. The experience had reminded him why he'd bought fractional ownership in the G700, not for luxury, but for the elimination of friction. Time was the only truly finite resource, and he'd spent enough of it waiting. Franklin persisted. "Even so, we should prepare for media requests. 60 Minutes has already called. The Times wants an interview. Forbes is planning a cover story whether you cooperate or not. Then they'll plan it without my input." The attorney's jaw worked against some argument he'd prepared and then discarded. Franklin had represented Nate through 4 major acquisitions, 2 FDA investigations into hospital practices, and 1 extremely ugly whistleblower suit that turned out to be a competitor's sabotage attempt. He knew when the conversation was over. The jet lifted off with the gentle authority of excellent engineering. Manhattan fell away below that impossible density of human ambition, compressing 8 million stories into a grid that somehow held together despite gravity and economics and the weight of everyone wanting more. Somewhere down there, Charlotte was climbing into a town car probably, or fielding calls from her mother, or staring at her phone watching her wedding photos get ratioed by strangers who'd never met her, but had already decided she represented everything wrong with the world. Nate pulled out his laptop. Email had accumulated like snow during the hearing, 57 new messages, most flagged urgent by people who believed their urgency constituted his priority. The CFO wanted approval on a Nashville expansion. HR needed sign-off on revised PTO policies. Marketing had mock-ups for the rebrand he'd greenlit 3 months ago. All of it mattered. None of it mattered. Sterling Medical would continue whether he answered tonight or next week, and that was the point. He'd built systems that didn't require his constant intervention. But one email caught his attention. The sender, Rebecca.Ashworth@sterlingmemorial.com. Subject line, "Congratulations on your 15 minutes." He clicked it open. Nate: "I watched the hearing on MSNBC between surgeries. Yes, we had MSNBC on in the surgeon's lounge. Blame Dr. Patterson and his political obsessions. I have 3 thoughts. First, you looked good in charcoal. The Brioni suits you better than the Carhartt, though I'll miss the coveralls aesthetic." Second, Charlotte's attorney was outmatched from the opening statement. Franklin Pierce is either brilliant or terrifying, possibly both. Third, and most importantly, the autoclave in OR7 is making a noise again. I know you're technically no longer pretending to be facilities staff, but could you take a look? The engineering team keeps saying it's fine, but I trust your judgment more than theirs. Also, coffee sometime. Actual coffee. Not the cafeteria sludge. My treat since you're apparently slumming it on $680 million. R. Nate read it twice. The first time for content, the second for subtext. Doctor. Rebecca Ashworth had worked at Sterling Memorial for 6 years, rising from attending surgeon to department head through a combination of technical brilliance and the kind of no-nonsense leadership that made residents simultaneously terrified and devoted. She was 48, divorced, and possessed the particular weariness of someone who'd survived their own betrayal and come out the other side with boundaries instead of bitterness. They'd crossed paths exactly once a week for 3 years during his facilities supervisor rotation, usually around 2 a.m. when elective surgeries ran long and something inevitably broke a monitor, a light, a temperamental piece of equipment that the engineering team wouldn't touch until morning. Nate had fixed things while Rebecca worked. They'd talked about equipment hospital politics, the strange intimacy of 2 a.m. conversations when everyone's guard was lowered by exhaustion. She'd never asked about his personal life, never commented on the expensive watch he sometimes forgot to swap for the Timex, never questioned why a facilities supervisor spoke with the vocabulary of someone who'd done more than just trade school. She'd simply accepted his presence as useful and his silence as preference. And now she was asking for coffee. He typed a reply, OR7 autoclave has a worn gasket on the pressure seal. I flagged it 4 months ago, but procurement hasn't ordered the replacement part because it's a custom spec, and they're trying to find a cheaper vendor. I'll have Margaret expedite it tomorrow. Coffee sounds good. Thursday, 3 p.m. Blue bottle on Newberry Fair warning. If we're seen together, Twitter will have theories. N. Send. Her response came back in under 2 minutes. Good. Rusty is honest. I'll bring my wallet and my curiosity. Also, for what it's worth, the coveralls suited you, but I'm curious what you look like when you're not pretending to be someone else. See you Thursday. R. Nate closed the laptop and allowed himself something close to a smile. Franklin glanced up from his files but said nothing, recognizing the particular expression of someone who'd just received good news and wasn't ready to share it yet. The jet began its descent into Boston, the city materializing through scattered clouds like something emerging from memory. The harbor looked slate gray in December light, dotted with container ships that moved with the patient certainty of things too large to rush. Somewhere below, Charlotte was probably landing to Preston's private jet, or maybe commercial now that her access to unlimited resources had collapsed along with her father's real estate empire and her 6-month marriage. 14 months ago, Nate had walked out of Winston Hartford's law office with nothing but his dignity and a signature on divorce papers. Charlotte had watched him go confusion and contempt fighting for dominance on her face, unable to comprehend why a man would refuse $75,000. Her father had called it smart, knowing his place, accepting reality. Her mother had called it pathetic. Preston, arriving 20 minutes later for his own meeting with Winston, had called it predictable. Guys like that always fold. None of them had thought to Google the name on the divorce decree. Nathaniel R. Sterling III. 3 seconds of curiosity would have revealed everything. Forbes profile, Wikipedia page, Bloomberg interviews he'd done before implementing his media blackout, the Wall Street Journal piece about his anonymous approach to philanthropy. But curiosity required humility, the admission that you might not know everything, and the Ashford family didn't traffic in uncertainty. The landing was smooth enough that Franklin didn't look up from his notes. Captain Morrison's voice came through the cabin speaker. Welcome to Boston, Mr. Sterling. Ground temperature is 34 degrees, winds out of the northeast at 12 knots. Your car is waiting at the terminal. The Bentley Flying Spur sat idling exactly where it always did, driver standing beside the rear door with the posture of someone who understood that attention to detail was the difference between employment and replacement. Nate had hired Bernard 8 years ago after watching him open a door for an elderly woman in a grocery store parking lot when it started raining. The gesture was reflexive, not performed, and that distinction mattered. Bernard nodded as Nate approached. Good afternoon, sir. Straight home, or would you like to stop at the office? Home. It's been a long day. The drive from Teterboro to Beacon Hill normally took 20 minutes, but Boston traffic had its own physics rush hour, started at 3 p.m. and ended whenever it felt like ending. Today they crawled through Back Bay while Bernard navigated with the calm of someone who'd long ago accepted that fighting traffic was like fighting weather, futile and exhausting. Nate's phone buzzed again. Grace this time calling instead of texting. He answered, "Let me guess, more memes." Her laugh carried the particular brightness of someone who'd just finished a successful surgery. "Dad, there's a meme comparing you to Batman. Another one has you photoshopped as a janitor mopping the floor while cash rains from the ceiling. Oh, and someone made a TikTok that's just clips of Charlotte's Instagram posts with the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme playing over them. It has 45 million views. Should I be concerned that you know what TikTok is? You're a surgeon. Aren't you supposed to be above social media?" "I'm 28, not 88. Also, yes, you should be concerned because Preston Whitmore just released a statement." Nate straightened. "What kind of statement?" "The divorce kind. He's filing to annul the marriage on grounds of fraud. Says Charlotte misrepresented her family's financial situation. The Post got the court documents 20 minutes ago." Through the window the city scrolled past in shades of brick and brownstone. Everything built to last by people who'd believed permanence was possible. The Ashford family had lived on Beacon Hill for 4 generations, their name carved into charity boards and country club rosters and the social registry that supposedly mattered to people who cared about such things. Now Preston Whitmore, who'd married into that name 6 days ago, was already trying to extract himself from the wreckage. Nate's voice came out flat. "He's divorcing her because her father's bankrupt." "According to the filing, yes. Also because the courthouse thing constitutes reputational damage to his professional standing. He's claiming she knew about you and deliberately concealed it to trap him into marriage under false pretenses." "That's not how fraud works." "Doesn't matter. The story's the story. Right now Twitter thinks Preston's the villain for leaving her when she's down. Give it 24 hours, someone will dig up dirt and the narrative will flip." Grace paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone asking a question she already knew the answer to. "How do you feel about it?" Nate watched a couple exit a coffee shop laughing about something only they understood, arms linked against the cold. They looked young enough that their problems were still solvable fights about dishes maybe, or whose turn it was to call their parents. Not the kind of problems that made headlines. "I don't feel anything. Charlotte made choices. Preston made choices. Now they're both living with consequences. That's not my responsibility." "But you knew this would happen. You knew showing up in court would blow up her whole life." "No. I knew showing up would reveal the truth. What happened after that was always going to depend on what kind of foundation her life was built on. Turns out it wasn't much of one." Grace went quiet for a moment. Background sounds filtered through the phone monitors, beeping a PA system announcing something unintelligible. The controlled chaos of a hospital operating at full capacity. When she spoke again, the surgeon's detachment had crept into her tone. "Mom used to say you were too honest for your own good. Your mother said a lot of things, most of them while driving 90 miles an hour to prove she could afford a faster car than someone else." "Dad, I know, too soon. It's been 5 years. I'm allowed dark humor." "You're allowed whatever you need. I just want to make sure you're okay." The Bentley pulled up to his building, a limestone fortress on Commonwealth Avenue that had been luxury apartments since Eisenhower was president. Bernard opened the door, and Nate stepped into cold air that smelled like car exhaust and old money. 20 feet away, a doorman stood at attention, already moving to open the brass-trimmed entrance before Nate reached it. Into the phone, "I'm fine, Grace. Better than fine. I just ended a test that took 3 years and cost me nothing except time. Charlotte failed. I have my answer. Now I can move forward." "Forward to what?" "Coffee with Dr. Ashworth on Thursday." Grace's laugh was sharp and surprised. "Rebecca Ashworth, the cardiac surgeon who looks like she could stare down a board meeting and make grown men cry. That's the one." "Dad, she's brilliant, also terrifying, also age-appropriate, emotionally available, and already knows you're rich. This is the best decision you've made since hiring me to consult on your hospital protocols. You're a cardiothoracic surgeon. I don't hire you, I tolerate your opinions." "Semantics. Go have coffee. Wear the navy suit, not the charcoal. And for God's sake, don't talk about Charlotte. Nobody wants to hear about the ex on a first date." "It's not a date, it's coffee." "Dad, it's a date. Own it." The line went dead before he could argue. Nate pocketed the phone and rode the elevator to the 45th floor, where his penthouse occupied the entire level 6,000 square feet of space he'd bought 8 years ago and furnished with the kind of careful attention that people mistook for interior designers, but was actually just him reading architecture magazines at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come. Margaret Beaumont had left files on his desk, contracts requiring signature, strategic plans needing review, the accumulated paperwork of running a $2 billion enterprise. But one message sat on top, marked urgent: "Sir, reminder, routine Medicare audit scheduled for Dorchester facility January 15th. All documentation prepared per standard protocol. Given recent media attention, recommend extra verification pass. MB." Nate made a mental note to have Theodore run the numbers twice. Not because anything was wrong. Sterling Medical's billing was cleaner than surgical instruments, but because in the current climate even routine audits could become weapons. Better to be paranoid than unprepared. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, but the area code was local. He almost didn't answer, then decided that avoiding calls was how problems metastasized. Nathaniel Sterling. The voice on the other end was ice wrapped in silk. "Enjoy your victory, Nathaniel. I hope it was worth it. Charlotte." Nate moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, watching lights come on across the city as day surrendered to evening. "Charlotte, I was wondering when you'd call. You humiliated me. In front of 300 people. In front of the entire world." Her voice didn't crack like it had in court. This was something harder, colder. "Preston left me. Filed for annulment this afternoon. Says I defrauded him by not disclosing that I'd divorced a billionaire. Preston's a coward who married you for your family name and is leaving now that the name's worthless. You're better off. Don't patronize me. You destroyed my life. I revealed information you could have discovered yourself with 30 seconds of effort. That's not destruction. That's just consequences." The silence that followed was different, charged with something Nate couldn't quite identify. Not grief, not even anger. Something calculating. Charlotte's voice dropped lower. "You think this is over? You think humiliating me at that courthouse was the end? I think you signed divorce papers 14 months ago and tried to reopen the case because you realized too late what you'd walked away from. The judge disagreed. That's called closure." "Closure." She laughed, brittle and sharp. "You have no idea what I'm capable of, Nathaniel. What we're capable of. Preston might be divorcing me, but we both know who's really responsible for destroying our lives. You and people who destroy things. They tend to have skeletons in their closets. Secrets they've kept hidden. Mistakes that look a lot worse under scrutiny." Nate's hand tightened on the phone. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise. You built your empire on deception, 3 years lying to your own wife. Makes me wonder what else you've lied about. Hospital billing, maybe regulatory compliance. All those acquisitions you pushed through so quickly." "My business practices are clean, Charlotte. Audited quarterly by independent firms and reviewed by federal regulators. You won't find anything." "Maybe, maybe not. But here's the thing about investigations, Nathaniel. They don't have to find anything to destroy you. They just have to look. And once they start looking, people start wondering what you're hiding. Investors get nervous. Partners reconsider. The press writes stories about smoke and fire. You're talking about weaponizing regulatory systems for a personal vendetta. That's a dangerous game." "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, you started this game when you decided to test me like a lab experiment. You wanted to see if I could love you without money. Congratulations. You got your answer. Now you get to live with what comes after." The line went dead. Nate stared at the phone, processing the conversation through filters built from 20 years navigating corporate warfare. Charlotte wasn't bluffing. The threat was real, coordinated, and backed by someone with resources, probably Preston, who had enough Goldman Sachs connections to make regulatory noise even without evidence. He dialed Franklin immediately. "Charlotte just called. She's planning something. Talking about investigations, regulatory scrutiny, questioning my business practices." Franklin's response was immediate. "That's bluster. She's angry and lashing out. We've got documentation on every deal, every acquisition, every billing practice." "I know we're clean, but she's right about one thing. Investigations don't need to find guilt to cause damage. They just need to exist. Nate moved away from the window, pacing. I want you to do two things. First, contact our crisis management firm, have them prepare messaging for potential regulatory inquiries. Second, run a preemptive internal audit on everything. Billing, licensing, acquisition, documentation. Anything someone with bad intentions could weaponize. That's defensive posture. Are you sure you want to signal that you're taking her threat seriously? I'm not signaling anything. I'm eliminating vulnerabilities before someone tries to exploit them. He ended the call and stood in his penthouse surrounded by art and furniture and the accumulated symbols of wealth that had failed to insulate him from anything that actually mattered. Charlotte's threat echoed, what we're capable of, not I. We. She wasn't working alone. A new text appeared on his phone. Unknown number. Mr. Sterling, this is Marcus Whitmore Preston's younger brother. We've never met, but I need to warn you about something. Can we talk? It's urgent. Nate stared at the message. Preston's brother reaching out to warn him that suggested either genuine concern or an elaborate trap. Given the day's trajectory, he couldn't afford to assume good faith. He typed back, what kind of warning? The response came immediately, not over text. Coffee tomorrow, 10 a.m. Thinking Cup in the North End. I'm not on Preston's side, but I know what he's planning. You need to hear this. Nate considered the angles. Meeting could be a set-up recorded conversation, manufactured evidence, another piece in whatever conspiracy Charlotte and Preston were building, but ignoring the warning meant walking blind into whatever they had planned. He texted, tomorrow 10 a.m. Come alone. His phone buzzed again. Grace texting instead of calling, Dad, there's chatter on medical boards about regulatory complaints against Sterling Medical. Nothing official yet, but people are asking questions. What's going on? Nate's jaw tightened. Charlotte wasn't wasting time. Less than an hour after her threat, the whisper campaign had already started. Questions on medical boards planted doubts, the slow-moving poison of institutional suspicion. He called Grace directly, Where are you hearing this? Resident group chat. Someone posted a screenshot from a medical licensing forum asking if anyone had worked at Sterling facilities and experienced irregular billing practices. It's probably nothing, but given today's headlines, it's not nothing. It's Charlotte starting a fire. Nate moved to his laptop, pulling up the medical board forums Grace mentioned. The post was there, anonymous, carefully worded to sound like genuine concern rather than attack. Given recent news about Sterling Medical's CEO deceiving his wife for 3 years, wondering if anyone has experienced similar deception in hospital operations, billing irregularities, credential misrepresentations, etc. 3 responses already, all anonymous, all raising questions without making accusations. Classic astroturfing, create the appearance of grassroots concern to trigger official inquiries. Into the phone, Grace, I need you to do something. Talk to your colleagues at Mass General, spread the word that this is a coordinated smear campaign. Sterling Medical's billing is clean, our credentials are verified, and anyone with actual concerns should contact the medical board directly instead of posting anonymous allegations online. You want me to defend you on message boards, Dad? I'm not asking you to defend me. I'm asking you to counter misinformation with facts before it metastasizes into something that requires official responses. He paused, softening his tone. Charlotte's not going to stop at social media posts. She's building a narrative. The best defense is transparency and preemptive truth. Grace was quiet for a moment, then, Okay, I'll make some calls, but Dad, be careful. People who feel humiliated do desperate things, and Charlotte just got humiliated in front of the entire internet. The call ended. Nate sat at his desk staring at the anonymous forum posts that would multiply overnight, spread through professional networks, and land on the desks of medical board investigators by week's end. Not because they were true, but because enough smoke eventually triggered someone to look for fire. His phone buzzed one more time. Rebecca, I'm assuming Thursday's still on despite whatever chaos is unfolding in your life. Fair warning. I don't scare easily, and I've dealt with worse than vengeful ex-spouses. See you at 3. R. Nate found himself smiling despite the day's accumulated weight. Rebecca's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of the chaos without demanding explanation or offering unsolicited advice felt like oxygen after hours of holding his breath. He typed back, "Thursday's still on. And thank you for not asking if I'm okay. Everyone asks if I'm okay." Her response, "Are you okay?" "No, but I will be." "Good enough. See you Thursday." Nate closed his laptop and moved back to the windows. Snow had started falling, fat flakes that melted on contact with pavement still holding the day's heat. The city glittered below all those individual lights representing lives being lived without the complications he'd invited through his choices. Charlotte had declared war. Preston was her ally. The medical boards would investigate. The press would write stories. His board would question his judgment. And somewhere in the machinery of regulatory bureaucracy, someone would wonder if a man who'd deceived his wife for 3 years might deceive patients, investors, or the public. But standing in his penthouse watching snow transform Boston into something temporarily cleaner, Nate felt something unexpected clarity, not about what was coming that remained murky and dangerous. Clarity about what he was willing to fight for and what he was finally ready to let go. The test with Charlotte was over. She'd failed spectacularly and publicly. But in showing her failure to the world, he'd also revealed his own, the assumption that testing people was safer than trusting them, that walls provided security rather than isolation, that winning meant being right instead of being connected. Thursday's coffee with Rebecca felt like the beginning of something. Charlotte's threat felt like the ending of something else. The only question was which one would define what came next. His phone sat dark on the desk, no more buzzing, no more threats, no more warnings. Just silence and snow, and the particular weight of decisions made and consequences arriving right on schedule. Nate turned off the lights and stood in darkness, watching the city, thinking about a coffee date in 4 days and a war that had already begun. Whatever storm Charlotte and Preston were building, it could wait until morning. Tonight, he had exactly what he'd claimed to want 3 years ago, the truth clearly revealed with all its sharp edges and uncomfortable implications. Turned out truth was expensive, but it was also the only thing worth the cost. Thursday arrived wearing the particular gray that Boston reserved for December afternoons when the sun gave up pretending. Nate stood in front of his closet at 2:15 p.m., staring at rows of suits that collectively cost more than most people's cars, and felt the unfamiliar weight of something close to nervousness. The navy chiton hung exactly where Margaret had placed it that morning. She'd intuited his needs before he'd articulated them, which was why she'd been his secretary for 18 years. He dressed with the deliberate precision of someone performing a ritual, shirt first, then trousers cufflinks that had belonged to his grandfather. The suit fit like it had been grown rather than tailored, which made sense given that the fitting had taken 4 hours and involved measurements he didn't know existed. The Patek Philippe stayed in its case. Instead, he chose the vintage Omega Speedmaster that had gone to the moon before he was born, elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of watch that required knowledge to recognize. Bernard had the Bentley waiting, but Nate waved him off. "I'll walk. It's 6 blocks." The cold hit him the moment he stepped outside that particular Boston chill that came off the harbor and settled into bones. Newbury Street hummed with the energy of people spending money they may or may not have, boutiques displaying handbags that cost more than quarterly rent, restaurants where lunch for 2 required a credit limit and a reservation made 3 weeks in advance. Blue Bottle sat halfway down the block, its minimalist aesthetic standing out among the brownstone facades like a meditation garden in a carnival. Rebecca was already there, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She sat at a corner table wearing charcoal slacks and a cream sweater that looked like cashmere but might have been something better. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested function over fashion, the eternal surgeon's compromise between professional appearance and the reality of spending 12 hours in scrubs. She looked up as Nate approached, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. Recognition maybe of the difference between the man who fixed autoclaves at 2 a.m. and the one who owned the building where the autoclaves lived. He opened the door. The scent of roasting coffee hit him immediately, that dark and complex aroma that reminded him of his first startup when he'd lived on espresso and ambition in a Cambridge basement that flooded every time it rained. Rebecca stood extending her hand with the formal precision of someone who'd spent decades in environments where professionalism was armor. Her grip was firm, warm. "You clean up well. The Navy's better than the charcoal. Grace has good taste." Nate paused mid-handshake. "How did you know Grace told me to wear Navy?" "Because you're brilliant but male, which means you probably would have defaulted to charcoal. Navy requires a woman's input." Rebecca gestured to the chair across from her. "Also, she texted me yesterday to make sure I didn't wear Navy because apparently matching is try-hard." Her words, not mine. "My daughter texted you." "Your daughter's been texting me for 6 months. We consult on complex cases. She's got excellent instincts for valve replacements." Rebecca settled back into her chair with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in her own skin. "Should I pretend to be surprised that you're rich, or can we skip that part I've known for 3 years? The pretense is exhausting." Nate sat feeling something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "How did you figure it out?" "You approved a $4 million MRI upgrade while wearing coveralls and eating a tuna sandwich from a lunchbox. The facility supervisor doesn't have that kind of authorization. Also, you knew the CEO's schedule better than his own secretary." And there was the small matter of the hospital being named Sterling Memorial. Occam's razor simplest explanation is usually correct. A barista approached young enough that his beard looked aspirational. He took their order cortado for Rebecca, straight espresso for Nate, and disappeared behind a chrome machine that hissed like Industrial Revolution nostalgia. Through the window, Newberry Street performed its daily theater. College students, pretending they could afford the boutiques, actual wealthy people pretending they weren't shopping tourists, pretending Boston was interesting in December. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "So, the courthouse thing. That was deliberate." Charlotte's attorney filed for post-divorce asset discovery. The hearing was mandatory. "But the private jet, the Rolls-Royce, the $8 million watch you wore to a legal proceeding, that was theater." Nate considered his response carefully. The espresso arrived dense and dark in a white ceramic cup that probably cost $40 because minimalism was expensive. He took a sip, letting the bitterness center him. "Charlotte spent 3 years looking at me and seeing a janitor. I wanted one moment where she had to see everything else. Not for revenge, for completion. And did it work? Do you feel complete?" "I feel finished with that chapter, which isn't the same thing, but it's close enough." Rebecca's cortado sat untouched, steam rising in delicate spirals. "My ex-husband left me for a pharmaceutical rep named Brittany, 28 years old, blonde, called everyone babe, including his mother. I found out because she posted a photo of them in Cabo on Instagram, and he was wearing the watch I'd bought him for our 15th anniversary." She finally picked up her cup, cradling it between both hands. "I thought about doing something dramatic, posting the divorce papers, hiring a plane to fly a banner over his office, but ultimately I just let it go. Not because I'm noble, but because trying to hurt him would have required me to keep thinking about him, and he wasn't worth the mental real estate. That's healthier than what I did." "Is it?" "You spent 3 years testing Charlotte. I spent 5 years avoiding anyone who might make me feel something. We both built walls. Yours were just more expensive." The words landed with the precision of surgical instruments, no malice, just observation. Nate found himself appreciating the directness. Most people in his tax bracket dealt in euphemisms and careful phrasing. Everything filtered through lawyers and PR consultants until language lost its teeth. Rebecca spoke like someone who'd seen people die on operating tables and learned that honesty was faster and kinder than comfort. He met her eyes. "Why did you ask me to coffee? You could have kept your distance. Let me be the billionaire on the news who used to fix your autoclave." "Because the billionaire on the news is boring. The guy who fixed my autoclave at 2 a.m. because he genuinely cared whether OR7 functioned properly, that guy's interesting." She took a slow sip of her cortado, considering. "Also, I'm 48 years old and tired of pretending I don't know what I want. I wanted coffee with someone who understands that wealth doesn't make you interesting, but curiosity does. You have curiosity. Most rich people I've met lost that somewhere around their 3rd vacation home." Nate's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. The movement must have registered on his face because Rebecca smiled. You're allowed to check. I'm not the kind of woman who gets offended by phones. People die when surgeons don't answer." He pulled out the device. Franklin Pierce calling instead of texting, which meant urgency. "I need to take this. 30 seconds." Rebecca nodded, turning her attention to the street outside with the practiced patience of someone who'd spent a career waiting for test results. Nate answered, "This better be important." Franklin's voice carried the clipped efficiency of crisis management. "Preston Whitmore's annulment filing hit the news 30 minutes ago. He's claiming Charlotte deliberately concealed her family's bankruptcy and your existence to defraud him into marriage. The Post is running with it. Bloomberg's calling it the messiest divorce of the decade, and it's only been 6 days since the wedding. That's not my problem. It becomes your problem when Charlotte's new attorney files a motion to reopen your divorce on grounds of coercion. They're arguing you psychologically manipulated her during your marriage, creating conditions of duress that invalidate her consent to the original settlement." Nate felt his jaw tighten. Across the table, Rebecca had gone very still, not looking at him, but clearly listening. He kept his voice level. "That's legally nonsense, and you know it." "Of course it's nonsense. But it's newsworthy nonsense. Judge Donovan already denied the request, but the filing exists. Media's running with the narrative that you're a billionaire who deliberately gaslit his wife for 3 years. Twitter's split between thinking you're a genius and thinking you're a sociopath. What does Charlotte want? Money, relevance, revenge? Take your pick." Franklin paused, and when he spoke again, the attorney's mask had slipped slightly. "Nate, I've known you for 15 years. You're not cruel, but this is starting to look cruel from the outside, and optics matter. Sterling Medical's stock is privately held, but your board is asking questions. 3 directors called this morning asking if this impacts the Nashville expansion. They're worried about brand reputation." Through the window, a young couple walked past, holding hands, laughing about something only they understood. They looked unburdened by anything heavier than deciding where to eat dinner. Nate envied them for exactly 3 seconds before remembering that envy was just another form of waste. "Schedule a board call for tomorrow morning. I'll address their concerns directly. As for Charlotte's attorney, file a motion to dismiss with prejudice. And Franklin, make it clear that any future filings of this nature will result in countersuit for harassment and abuse of process. You want to sue your ex-wife for filing legal motions? I want her attorney to understand that there are consequences for wasting the court's time with frivolous claims designed solely to generate headlines." He ended the call and pocketed the phone. Rebecca had returned her attention to him, her expression unreadable in the way that experienced surgeons learn to control their faces, nothing showing except what they chose to reveal. Nate spoke before she could ask, "My ex-wife is trying to reopen our divorce. Her new attorney thinks if she can prove I manipulated her, she'll be entitled to a settlement after all." "And did you manipulate her?" "I tested her. There's a difference." "Is there?" Rebecca's voice carried no judgment, just genuine curiosity. "If you set up conditions specifically designed to reveal someone's worst qualities, aren't you manipulating the outcome?" The question hung between them, more complex than it first appeared. Nate considered deflecting, changing the subject, steering the conversation back to safer territory. But something about Rebecca's directness demanded equivalent honesty. "Maybe, probably. But the alternative was marrying someone who'd spend our entire lives resenting me for not being wealthy enough, only to discover after her death that I'd been lying about money the whole time. I chose the pain up front instead of the pain deferred." "That's very rational." "You say that like it's a criticism." "It's an observation. Rationality is useful in business. In relationships, it's often just fear wearing a better suit." A group of college students burst through the door, bringing cold air and loud conversation about some professor's allegedly unfair grading policy. They clustered around the counter, oblivious to everything except their own drama. Nate watched them with the detachment of someone who remembered being 22 and convinced that everything mattered intensely and nothing mattered at all. Rebecca waited until the noise subsided before continuing, "I'm not here to judge your choices, Nate. You tested Charlotte because your first wife died chasing status, and you needed to know the woman you married wouldn't do the same. That makes sense. But at some point you have to stop testing and start trusting, or you'll spend the rest of your life running experiments instead of building relationships. Is that what you did after your divorce? No. I built walls and called it self-protection. Dated exactly 3 men in 5 years, all of them safe and boring and guaranteed not to matter. Then I turned 48 and realized I'd successfully protected myself right into loneliness. She finished her cortado and set the cup down with quiet finality. So here I am having coffee with a billionaire who fixes autoclaves and lies by omission. Apparently I'm done with safe. Nate felt something shift in his chest, not quite hope, not quite fear, but some combination that felt suspiciously like possibility. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time a text from Grace. "Dad, check Bloomberg, now." He pulled up the browser. The headline loaded in stark sans serif, Sterling Medical Board calls emergency meeting amid CEO's personal scandal. The article was 4 paragraphs of carefully sourced speculation. Anonymous board members expressing concern about Nathaniel Sterling's judgment and character. Investors questioning whether someone who'd deceived his wife for 3 years could be trusted to lead a healthcare organization. Competitors circling the Nashville expansion like sharks who'd smelled blood in the water. Rebecca leaned across the table reading upside down with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years reviewing charts in chaotic ERs. "They're actually questioning your fitness to run the company you built." "Apparently." Nate's voice came out flat. 3 years hiding wealth from my wife equals questionable ethics in hospital management. Never mind that Sterling Medical has the lowest malpractice rate in the industry and the highest patient satisfaction scores. One personal decision is now evidence of systemic character flaws. That's absurd. That's optics. He locked the phone and set it face down on the table, a small act of defiance against the urge to keep refreshing. "The board meets tomorrow. I'll address their concerns. They'll posture about fiduciary responsibility and protecting shareholder value. I'll remind them that there are no shareholders because we're privately held and I own 68% of the company. They'll back down. This is theater." Rebecca studied him with the intensity she probably brought to preoperative evaluations, looking for signs of stress or compromise that might affect performance. "You're very calm for someone whose professional reputation is being questioned in real time. Panic doesn't solve problems. It just makes you feel like you're doing something while actually accomplishing nothing." Nate signaled the barista for another espresso. "Besides, this isn't the first time someone's tried to leverage my personal life against my professional competence. When Abigail died, 3 board members suggested I step down temporarily because I was emotionally compromised. I declined. The company's revenue increased 22% that year. Because you buried yourself in work. Because work was something I could control when everything else was chaos." The barista delivered his second espresso along with a knowing look that suggested he'd recognized Nate from the news and was waiting to see if there'd be drama. When none materialized, he retreated with visible disappointment. Nate wrapped both hands around the small cup, appreciating the heat. Rebecca's next question came quietly. "What do you actually want, Nate? Not what's rational or strategic. What do you want?" The question was simple. The answer wasn't. Nate looked out the window at Newberry Street at the people moving through their lives with the confidence of those who hadn't yet learned that control was mostly illusion. He'd spent 3 years testing Charlotte, 5 years mourning Abigail, 2 decades building an empire that apparently meant nothing if the optics were wrong. And through it all, he'd operated under the assumption that wanting less kept him safer than wanting more. But sitting across from Rebecca Ashworth, who'd known he was lying for 3 years and never weaponized the information, who'd asked him to coffee knowing exactly who he was, who looked at him now with something that might be interest or might be challenge or might be both. Nate found himself tired of safety. His voice came out rougher than intended. "I want to stop explaining myself to people who've already decided who I am. I want the board meeting tomorrow to be the last time I have to defend the difference between privacy and deception, and I want to have dinner with you sometime when I'm not checking my phone every 30 seconds to see which part of my life is imploding next." Rebecca's smile was small but genuine. "That's honest. I appreciate honest." She pulled out her own phone, checking something quickly. I'm on call this weekend, but Monday's clear. There's a place in the North End that does osso buco that'll make you forget you have problems. 8 p.m. Monday works. Good. It's a date. An actual date, not coffee. She stood gathering her coat with efficient movements. Fair warning, I'm going to ask you uncomfortable questions about why you really tested Charlotte, and I'm not going to accept because Abigail died as a complete answer. But I'll also tell you about my own terrible decisions, and we'll see if two people who've both built excellent walls can figure out how to build something else. Nate stood as well, suddenly aware of how small the coffee shop felt. How many people were probably watching without seeming to watch? Should I wear the navy suit again? Wear whatever makes you feel like yourself. I've seen you in coveralls covered in hydraulic fluid. The bar's pretty low. Rebecca extended her hand again, and this time when Nate shook it, the gesture felt less like formality and more like promise. See you Monday, Nathaniel Sterling. Try not to let the board fire you before then. She left, weaving through the college students still arguing about their professor. Nate watched her go, then sat back down to finish his espresso. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but he drank it anyway, letting the bitterness ground him in the present moment. His phone buzzed. Margaret, this time texting instead of calling because she understood the hierarchy of urgency. Sir, the board wants the meeting moved to tonight. 7 p.m. Conference Room A. All 12 directors attending. Franklin's already drafting talking points. Nate typed back, confirm, I'll be there at 6:45. Another buzz, different sender. Grace. Mom would have liked her. Rebecca, I mean, she doesn't take your bullshit, which means she actually sees you. That's rare. He stared at the message for a long moment. Grace rarely mentioned Abigail directly. The wound had scarred over, but the tissue was still fragile. The fact that she'd brought her mother into this conversation meant something, though Nate wasn't entirely sure what. He typed carefully. Your mother would have also pointed out that I'm overthinking this and should just have dinner without analyzing the sociological implications. Grace's response was immediate. Exactly. So do that. Also, the board thing is bullshit. You built Sterling Medical from nothing. They're scared because the Nashville expansion makes them look unnecessary, and your personal life is a convenient excuse. Remind them who signs their checks. Nate left $40 on the table, enough to cover 2 coffees and tip, like someone who remembered what it was like to survive on tips. The walk back to Commonwealth Avenue took him past boutiques. He'd never shopped in restaurants. He'd never tried the accumulated commercial infrastructure of people with disposable income and somewhere to be. He thought about Charlotte, probably in some lawyer's office right now, strategizing her next move. About Preston, probably already on dating apps, claiming the whole marriage was a mistake. About the board members who'd spent years rubber-stamping his decisions and were now suddenly concerned about his judgment. Bernard had the Bentley waiting exactly where Nate had left it, because Bernard understood that some meetings required arriving in a car that cost more than most houses. The drive to Sterling Medical Holdings headquarters took 12 minutes, which gave Nate exactly enough time to review Franklin's talking points and decide to ignore most of them. The building rose 60 stories above the financial district, all glass and steel and architectural ambition. Sterling Medical occupied floors 40 through 60 with the executive suite at the top because symbolism mattered in corporate hierarchy. Nate rode the elevator alone, watching the city shrink below him through the transparent walls. Boston becoming a model of itself, all those individual lives compressed into patterns of light and movement. The conference room was already set up when he arrived. 12 chairs arranged around an oval table, each position marked with a leather portfolio and a bottle of overpriced water. Franklin stood by the windows, reviewing notes on his tablet. He looked up as Nate entered. They're coming in hot. Montgomery called 3 directors personally. He's positioning this as a referendum on your leadership. Montgomery Ashford, Charlotte's bankrupt father, who can barely manage his own real estate portfolio, is questioning my leadership. He's desperate and vindictive, which makes him dangerous. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you're emotionally unstable, that the courthouse stunt proves you prioritize personal vendettas over corporate responsibility. Franklin set down his tablet. Nate, I need you to be diplomatic tonight. I know that's not your default setting, but these people have the theoretical power to call for your removal as CEO. They have theoretical power. I have actual shares. 68% beats 12 angry board members every time. In a proxy fight, yes. In the court of public opinion, they can make noise that affects the Nashville expansion, the bank relationships, the partnerships with insurance companies. Perception is half the battle in healthcare. The first board member arrived at 6:52, Theodore Lancaster, the CFO, who'd been with Nate since the first hospital acquisition 12 years ago. Theodore looked uncomfortable in his suit, like someone attending a funeral for a relationship that wasn't quite dead yet. He nodded at Nate, taking his seat without the usual small talk about quarterly numbers or market trends. By 7 p.m., all 12 directors had assembled. 6 men, 6 women, all wearing expressions that ranged from concerned to openly hostile. At the far end of the table, Senator Patricia Hayes, retired. Massachusetts sat with the rigid posture of someone who'd spent 3 decades being photographed and had learned that slouching was weakness. Next to her, Dr. Cornelius Wright, former Surgeon General under 2 administrations, reviewed something on his phone with the distracted air of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Nate took his seat at the head of the table. Franklin sat to his right, legal pad already open. The room felt charged with the particular tension that preceded either revolution or capitulation, and Nate couldn't quite tell which. Senator Hayes spoke first, her voice carrying the practiced modulation of someone who'd spent years making speeches. "Nathaniel, we appreciate you making time on short notice. I'll be direct. 3 board members have expressed serious concerns about recent events and their potential impact on Sterling Medical's reputation and operational capacity." "Which 3? That's not relevant." "It's extremely relevant, Patricia. If 3 anonymous cowards want to question my judgment, they should have the courage to attach their names to the accusation." Dr. Wright set down his phone. "I'm one of them. I called Patricia yesterday after reading the Bloomberg piece." "Nate, you've built something extraordinary here, but the optics are terrible. A CEO who deceived his wife for 3 years, who showed up to court in a Rolls Royce while she cried for the cameras. It looks vindictive. It looks cruel. And in healthcare, where trust is everything, it looks disqualifying." Nate kept his voice level. "I didn't deceive Charlotte. I simply didn't volunteer information she never asked for. My legal name was always on our marriage certificate. The hospital where I worked has my surname on the building. Google exists. She chose not to look." Another director spoke up. Malcolm Pierce, no relation venture capitalist who'd been on the board for 8 years. "But you set up the conditions deliberately. You wore coveralls, drove an old truck, lived in a modest apartment. That's not passive omission, that's active construction of a false narrative. I lived within my means. The fact that my means were greater than Charlotte knew doesn't make the living false." Senator Hayes leaned forward. "Nathaniel, we're not here to litigate your marriage. We're here because this situation has created a PR crisis that affects Sterling Medical's relationships with regulatory bodies, insurance partners, and the communities we serve. The Nashville expansion is already facing pushback from local media questioning whether we're the kind of organization that embodies healthcare values. Your personal choices are becoming corporate liabilities." Theodore cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. As CFO, his word carried weight that the other board members respected. "With all due respect to my colleagues, I think we're conflating personal judgment with professional competence. Nate's marriage is his business. Sterling Medical's performance speaks for itself. We've grown revenue 22% year over year for 6 consecutive years. Patient outcomes are industry-leading. Malpractice claims are down 40% from industry average. Employee retention is at 91%. Those numbers don't lie." "Numbers don't address character," Dr. Wright countered. "We're healthcare providers. Our CEO needs to embody the values of care, transparency, and trust. How can Nate lead an organization built on those principles when his personal life demonstrates the opposite?" The room erupted into overlapping arguments. Senator Hayes tried to restore order with parliamentary procedure that nobody followed. Malcolm Pierce was typing furiously on his phone, probably drafting a statement for whatever media outlet would pay attention. Franklin scribbled notes that would become the legal foundation for whatever came next. Nate waited. He'd learned decades ago that letting people exhaust themselves was more effective than interrupting their momentum. The arguing peaked, plateaued, and finally descended into uncomfortable silence when everyone realized they'd been talking past each other for 5 minutes without resolution. When the quiet felt sufficiently heavy, Nate spoke. "You want to talk about character? Let's talk about it. I built Sterling Medical from a failing community hospital that was 3 months from bankruptcy. I bought it with money I'd made from a healthcare tech startup, and I spent 2 years sleeping in my office because I couldn't afford both rent and payroll. I learned every job in that hospital: orderly, janitor, IT facilities, nursing support. I learned them because I needed to understand the work, not just manage it from a distance." He paused, making eye contact with each board member in turn. "When I married Charlotte, I'd already buried one wife who died chasing status symbols. I tested Charlotte because I needed to know if she could love someone without a net worth attached. She couldn't. That's not cruelty. That's self-preservation. And if you think protecting myself from a repeat of the worst experience of my life disqualifies me from running this company, then you're questioning the wrong judgment." Dr. Wright's expression had softened slightly, but he pressed forward. "What about the courthouse? The private jet? The Rolls-Royce? The watch that costs more than most people earn in a year? That wasn't self-preservation. That was making a point." "Yes, it was. Charlotte spent 3 years looking at me with contempt because I drove an old truck. Her father offered me charity jobs because he thought I was beneath his daughter. Her mother asked when I'd amount to something, as if my worth was measurable in salary. I wanted one moment where they had to confront the fact that their assumptions were wrong. I'm not apologizing for that." Senator Hayes tapped her pen against her portfolio. "We're not asking you to apologize, Nathaniel. We're asking you to consider how this affects the organization. The Nashville expansion requires city council approval. 3 council members have already expressed concerns about bringing in a controversial healthcare provider. We've got community groups protesting, media running negative stories, and competitors using your personal life as evidence that Sterling Medical lacks integrity. Then we address those concerns directly. We release patient outcome data. We showcase employee testimonials. We demonstrate through evidence that Sterling Medical's values are reflected in our work, not my marriage." Nate leaned back, letting his body language convey the calm he'd cultivated over decades. "But we don't apologize for things that don't require apology. And we certainly don't let Charlotte's attorney and Montgomery Ashford's bankruptcy-fueled vendetta dictate corporate strategy." The silence that followed was different, less hostile, more contemplative. Franklin made a note that probably read "good" or possibly "don't push further." Theodore was nodding slightly, his allegiance clear. The other directors were calculating weighing optics against outcomes, reputation against revenue. Malcolm Pierce spoke carefully. "What if we brought in a crisis management firm, someone to handle the PR, reshape the narrative, get ahead of the negative coverage? We have a PR team. We have an in-house communications department. I'm talking about professionals who specialize in executive reputation management, people who've handled worse than this." Nate considered the suggestion. Part of him wanted to refuse on principle. Hiring reputation managers felt like admitting guilt, like accepting the premise that his personal choices required professional spin. But another part, the part that had built a $2 billion enterprise by knowing when to delegate, recognized the tactical value. "Fine. Bring me 3 firms by tomorrow afternoon. I'll review their proposals and select one by end of week." Senator Hayes looked surprised that he'd agreed. "That's very reasonable, Nathaniel." "I'm not unreasonable, Patricia. I'm just tired of people assuming my privacy was deception and my boundaries were manipulation." He stood, signaling the meeting's end. "Sterling Medical moves forward with Nashville. The crisis management firm handles external messaging, and this board focuses on governance instead of gossip. Are we clear?" 12 heads nodded with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The meeting dissolved into the standard post-conference murmuring, directors gathering their portfolios and forming small clusters of whispered conversation. Theodore approached Nate directly. "That went better than I expected. You actually showed restraint. Franklin threatened to bill me extra if I called anyone an idiot." "Smart man, that Franklin." Theodore glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. With Charlotte, I mean. Maybe not the kind thing, but the right thing. There's a difference." Nate's phone buzzed. Grace again. "Please tell me you didn't tell the board to go fuck themselves." He typed back, "I showed admirable restraint and agreed to hire a PR firm. Who are you and what have you done with my father?" The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up, probably because Franklin spent the entire descent detailing next steps, selecting the crisis firm, coordinating messaging, preparing statements for media inquiries. Nate listened with half his attention, the other half already moving toward Monday night and dinner in the North End, and the question Rebecca had asked, "What do you actually want?" Not what was rational, not what was strategic. What did he want? The answer, terrifyingly simple, was to stop fighting battles that should have ended years ago and start building something that didn't require constant defense. But knowing what you wanted and being capable of achieving it were separated by the vast distance of habit and fear and the weight of every previous failure. Bernard had the Bentley waiting. The drive back to Commonwealth Avenue took them through the city at rush hour, when Boston transformed into a meditation on human patience. Nate watched people in adjacent cars, some screaming at traffic, others singing along to music. Only they could hear, all of them moving through their own narratives that would never intersect with his. Except for this brief moment of shared frustration. His phone rang. Unknown number, but local area code. Against his better judgment, he answered, "Nathaniel Sterling." The voice was male, young, nervous. "Mr. Sterling, this is Marcus Whitmore, Preston's younger brother. I need to talk to you about something important." Nate gestured to Bernard to keep driving, not ready to arrive home yet. "I'm listening." "Preston's planning something. I don't know exactly what, but he's been meeting with Charlotte's new attorney. They're talking about a joint filing. Something about proving you created a pattern of deception that extends beyond your marriage and into your business practices. They want to depose your staff, subpoena hospital records, find evidence that you've been hiding things from more than just your wife." "Why are you telling me this? Preston's your brother." Marcus's laugh was bitter. "Preston's an asshole who spent his entire life using people and discarding them when they're no longer useful. He did it to Charlotte. He's doing it to your reputation. And he'll do it to me the second I stop being his little brother and start being an inconvenience." The sound of traffic filtered through the phone. Marcus was outside somewhere, probably hiding from whoever he was betraying. "I don't want any part of it, so I'm giving you a heads up. They're coming for you and they're not going to stop at your marriage." The call ended before Nate could respond. He stared at the phone, processing the information through the filter of someone who'd spent 20 years navigating corporate warfare and knew the difference between posturing and genuine threat. Preston and Charlotte forming an alliance made strategic sense, two people who'd both lost something they felt entitled to, joining forces against the man they blamed for their downfall. But attempting to prove systematic deception in business practices, that required evidence that didn't exist because whatever lies Nate had told in his personal life, his professional conduct was documented, audited, and scrutinized by regulators who didn't care about marital status. Still, the fact that they were trying meant this wasn't over. The courthouse hadn't been closure, it had been opening arguments. Nate dialed Franklin. "We need to talk. Preston Whitmore and Charlotte are planning a joint action. Something about proving pattern and practice of deception." Franklin's sigh carried the weight of someone who'd just watched his evening plans evaporate. "Of course they are. Because one legal battle wasn't enough. I'll start preemptive discovery, get ahead of whatever they're planning. This is going to cost you, Nate." "Everything costs. At least this I can afford." He ended the call as the Bentley pulled up to his building. The doorman moved with practiced efficiency, opening the car door before Bernard could. Nate stepped into cold air that promised snow, but wouldn't deliver for hours yet. And he thought about Rebecca's question one more time. What did he want? To stop being punished for choosing privacy over performance. To have dinner Monday without checking his phone every 30 seconds. To build something with someone who knew exactly who he was and wanted coffee anyway. Small things, maybe. But after 3 years of testing, and 14 months of waiting, and 65 years of learning that wanting too much led to losing everything, small things felt revolutionary. The elevator carried him up to the 45th floor, and Nate stepped into his penthouse thinking about Monday and Osobuco and the possibility that sometimes the test was knowing when to stop testing. Monday arrived disguised as opportunity. Nate spent the weekend reviewing crisis management proposals, 3 firms each promising to reshape his narrative through strategic messaging and carefully orchestrated media placements. By Sunday night, he'd selected Whitmore and Associates partly for their track record with healthcare executives and partly because their name-sharing with Preston felt like poetic irony. The Osobuco reservation was confirmed for 8 p.m. at Mama Maria, a North End institution where tourists went for atmosphere and locals went because the food justified the 3-week wait for tables. Nate arrived at 7:52, early enough to seem eager, but late enough to avoid appearing desperate. The restaurant occupied a converted townhouse, all exposed brick and low lighting that forgave the passage of time on faces that had earned their years honestly. Rebecca was already seated, wearing midnight blue that made the surgeon's scrubs seem like distant memory. Her hair was down, which he hadn't seen before dark, with threads of silver she hadn't bothered dyeing, because vanity required caring what strangers thought. She looked up as the hostess guided him to the table, and something in her expression suggested she'd been watching the door with the same careful anticipation he'd felt walking in. He slid into the chair across from her. "You're early." Surgeons are pathologically punctual. 30 years of OR schedules where 5 minutes late means someone dies. She'd already ordered wine, a Barolo that probably cost more than the meal, sitting half-finished in a glass she held with the casual familiarity of someone who understood that good wine was meant to be enjoyed, not Instagrammed. "How was your weekend? Did the board fire you?" "They considered it. Ultimately decided my majority ownership made termination impractical." "That's corporate speak for you told them to pound sand." "I told them we'd hire crisis management and move forward with Nashville. They interpreted that as leadership." Nate accepted the menu from a waiter who'd materialized with the silent efficiency of expensive service. "Preston Whitmore's planning something. His brother called to warn me. Apparently there's going to be a joint filing with Charlotte, trying to prove systematic deception across my business practices." Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly, the same focus she probably brought to identifying arterial bleeds. "Can they prove that?" "No, because it doesn't exist. But they can create noise, subpoena records, depose employees who'll get nervous under questioning and say things that sound worse than they are when stripped of context." He set down the menu without reading it. He'd been coming here long enough to know the Osobuco didn't require review. "My attorney's handling it. I'm trying not to let it consume mental bandwidth that could be better spent elsewhere." "Elsewhere, like dinner with someone who's going to ask uncomfortable questions." "Exactly like that." The waiter returned, took their orders with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd memorized every dish and its preparation. When he disappeared, Rebecca leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "Okay, here's my uncomfortable question. Why did you really test Charlotte? And before you give me the rational answer about Abigail dying in a car crash, I want the true answer, the one you probably haven't said out loud." Nate felt something tighten in his chest. Not quite panic, but its cousin, the awareness that honesty required vulnerability he'd spent decades avoiding. The restaurant hummed with conversations happening at other tables, all those people navigating their own complications while pretending everything was simple. He met Rebecca's eyes. "Because I'm terrified of being loved for the wrong reasons. Abigail married me when I had nothing. We built Sterling Medical together. She handled operations while I focused on acquisitions. For 10 years we were partners in every sense. Then the money came. Not overnight, but fast enough that we didn't adjust properly. Suddenly she was competing with other wealthy wives buying cars to prove something I didn't understand. The crash wasn't suicide, but it wasn't entirely accidental either. She was racing someone, racing to prove she belonged in a world I'd accidentally given her access to." Rebecca listened without interrupting her stillness, the kind that invited continuation rather than demanded it. Nate continued. After she died, I realized I'd created the conditions for her death by building wealth without building wisdom to handle it. So when I met Charlotte, I decided to reverse the test. Instead of giving her money and watching what it did to her, I withheld it and watched what the absence did. Turns out, absence revealed the same disease: she couldn't love someone she perceived as lesser, which meant she couldn't actually love me at all. That's honest, also deeply sad. Sad assumes I wanted a different outcome. Mostly I wanted data. You're lying to yourself if you think you didn't want Charlotte to pass. Rebecca took another sip of wine, considering. Testing people isn't about data collection. It's about giving yourself permission to stay closed while pretending you're open. You wanted Charlotte to fail so you could confirm your hypothesis that everyone loves money more than they love you. The observation landed with surgical precision, cutting through rationalizations Nate had constructed over 3 years. He could have deflected, argued, retreated into the intellectual fortress where feelings were analyzed rather than felt. Instead, he sat with the discomfort and discovered it wasn't fatal. His voice came out quieter. Maybe, probably, but the alternative was marrying someone and spending every day wondering if she'd leave the moment someone richer showed up. At least this way I knew. And now you know. Charlotte failed. Preston failed. Your in-laws failed. Congratulations, you've successfully proven that people who marry for status will leave for status. What are you going to do with that information? Have dinner with someone who already knows I'm rich and showed up anyway. Rebecca's smile was small but genuine. That's a start, but eventually you're going to have to decide whether you're capable of trusting someone without testing them first, because I'm not interested in being experiment number 2. The food arrived before Nate could respond. Osobuco for both of them, the veal so tender it fell apart under gentle pressure, the gremolata cutting through richness with bright acidity. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, the kind of quiet that didn't require filling because both parties were secure enough to let stillness exist. Halfway through the meal, Nate's phone buzzed. He ignored it. The second buzz came 30 seconds later. The third suggested urgency that wouldn't wait for politeness. Rebecca gestured toward his pocket. Answer it. I told you phones don't offend me. He checked the screen. Franklin Pierce texting in all caps. Call me now. Preston and Charlotte filed joint complaint with Massachusetts Medical Board, claiming you falsified credentials during hospital inspections. Nate's hand tightened around the phone. The accusation was absurd. His credentials were public record, verified by multiple regulatory bodies, scrutinized during every hospital acquisition. But absurd didn't mean harmless. Medical board complaints triggered automatic investigations, and investigations meant depositions, audits, media coverage that would make the courthouse incident look like a rehearsal. Rebecca was watching him carefully. What is it? They filed with the medical board. Preston and Charlotte joint complaint alleging I falsified credentials. He set the phone face down, an act of will against the urge to start calling attorneys and preparing defenses. It's baseless, but it doesn't matter. The complaint itself is the weapon. The process is the punishment. Can they actually make that stick? No, my credentials are legitimate. I'm not a physician, but I never claimed to be. Sterling Medical's licensing is handled by actual doctors who meet every regulatory requirement. But proving my innocence requires time, resources, and public attention on a narrative that makes me look guilty until proven otherwise. Rebecca set down her fork with deliberate precision. So what's your next move? Franklin's probably already drafting the response. We'll file a motion to dismiss, provide documentation, and wait for the board to realize this is harassment disguised as oversight. Nate picked up his wine glass, then set it down untouched. The real problem isn't the complaint. It's the pattern. Preston and Charlotte are coordinating attacks designed to make me spend all my time playing defense. Every response costs money and attention. Every headline reinforces the narrative that where there's smoke, there must be fire. That's not a question. What I'm asking is, what are you going to do? Not your attorney, not your crisis management firm, you. The question hung between them, more complex than it appeared. Nate had spent 20 years building systems that insulated him from personal involvement. Attorneys handled legal matters. Executives managed operations. Staff dealt with problems before they reached his desk. Delegation was efficiency, But delegation also meant never having to directly confront the people causing problems, and right now insulation felt less like strategy and more like cowardice. He met Rebecca's eyes. "I don't know." The rational response is to let the professionals handle it. The emotional response is to call Preston directly and explain exactly what happens to people who weaponize regulatory systems for personal vendettas. And which response wins? Historically rational, every time. Nate paused, feeling something shift in his chest, a decision forming before his conscious mind caught up. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe I've spent so long avoiding emotional responses that I've forgotten how to fight battles that actually matter. Rebecca leaned back slightly, studying him with the intensity she probably brought to complex surgical cases. "You want my opinion?" "Always." "Fight back. Not through lawyers and PR firms, they'll do their jobs regardless. But you personally directly need to stop letting Preston and Charlotte control the narrative. They're counting on you being too dignified to engage, too wealthy to care, too isolated to respond. Prove them wrong." "How?" "I don't know yet. But I know hiding behind attorneys isn't working, and neither is pretending this doesn't affect you." She picked up her wine glass, considering something. "When my ex-husband left me for Brittany, I spent 6 months being dignified. Took the high road. Let my attorney handle everything while I focused on work. Know what happened? He got to be the victim. Poor man driven away by his cold, career-obsessed wife. Meanwhile, I got to be the bitter divorcee who couldn't keep her husband happy. What changed? I stopped being dignified. Showed up at his office with the credit card statements showing he'd been buying Brittany jewelry for 8 months before he left. Didn't make a scene, didn't yell, just left them on his desk where his partners would see them during their lunch meeting. He was counseled out of the firm 3 weeks later. Rebecca's smile was sharp enough to cut. Sometimes the high road is just another way of letting terrible people win by default. Nate's phone buzzed again. Grace this time. "Dad, I'm seeing reports about a medical board complaint. Please tell me you're not having dinner with Dr. Ashworth while your career implodes." He texted back, "Career's fine, dinner's better, talk tomorrow." Rebecca had been watching the exchange. "Your daughter, worried I'm not taking this seriously enough." "Are you?" "I'm taking it exactly as seriously as it deserves, which is somewhere between nuisance and distraction." Nate finished his osso buco, appreciating the way the meat had been braised to the point where structure became suggestion. "The medical board will investigate, find nothing, and dismiss the complaint. Preston and Charlotte will file something else. The cycle continues until they run out of money or I run out of patience. And when you run out of patience, that's the question I've been avoiding." The waiter cleared their plates with practiced efficiency, offering dessert menus they both declined in favor of espresso double for Nate macchiato for Rebecca. The restaurant had filled during dinner, every table occupied by couples and families navigating their own complications under the generous cover of low lighting and good food. Rebecca's macchiato arrived first, and she held the small cup between both hands. "Can I tell you what I see when I look at you? Should I be concerned? Probably." She took a sip, gathering her thoughts. "I see someone brilliant and successful who's convinced himself that isolation is strength. You built an empire, tested your wife to failure, and showed up to court in a Rolls-Royce to prove a point. All of it from behind walls so high you can't see that you're alone at the top." That's fairly harsh. It's accurate, and before you get defensive, I'm not criticizing. I've done the same thing. Built a career, avoided relationships, convinced myself that professional success was sufficient substitution for personal connection. Rebecca set down her cup. "But here's what I've learned. Walls keep out the bad, but they also keep out the good. And after 5 years of keeping everyone out, I'm tired of being safe and lonely." Nate's espresso arrived, providing convenient excuse to delay responding. The coffee was exactly what expensive Italian restaurants did well, dense and bitter and honest about what it was. He drank it slowly, buying time to formulate something that sounded less defensive than his instincts demanded. Finally, "What are you suggesting? That we're both too old and too smart to pretend this is casual coffee between colleagues? I'm interested in you, not your money. I make enough as a surgeon that your net worth is impressive but not life-changing. Not your power. I've got my own thanks. I'm interested in the man who fixed autoclaves at 2 a.m., because he genuinely cared whether operating rooms functioned. That man is interesting. The billionaire hiding behind attorneys is just expensive. The honesty was disarming, which was probably the point. Nate had spent decades in negotiations where everyone performed elaborate dances around what they actually wanted, all strategy and no substance. Rebecca's directness felt like speaking a language he'd forgotten he knew. He leaned forward. "I'm interested in you too, but I'm terrible at this. Relationships, vulnerability, trusting people without testing them first. I've got more money than I'll ever spend and less idea how to build something real than I did at 25. That's honest. I can work with honest." Rebecca glanced at her watch, not dismissive, just aware. "I'm on call in 4 hours, which means I need to leave soon. But before I do, I want to establish something. I don't need you to be perfect. I don't need you to have all the answers. I just need you to show up as yourself, not as the carefully constructed version who's passed every test you've designed. Can you do that?" The question was simple. The answer required confronting whether he was capable of showing up without armor, without strategy, without the protective distance that had kept him safe and miserable for years. Nate's voice came out rougher than intended. "I don't know, honestly, but I'm willing to try. That's enough for now." Rebecca stood gathering her coat with efficient movements. "Walk me to my car." They settled the bill. Nate's credit card. Rebecca's principled objection overruled by his pointing out that he'd picked the restaurant and therefore bore responsibility for the check. Outside, the North End had transformed into its evening version, all narrow streets and restaurant lights, and the particular energy of a neighborhood that had outlasted trends by simply being itself. Rebecca's car was parked 3 blocks away, a sensible Volvo that suggested someone who valued safety over status. They walked in comfortable silence, their breath visible in December air that had decided snow was imminent but not quite ready to commit. At her car, Rebecca turned to face him. "Thank you for dinner, and for being honest about not knowing how to do this. That's actually more promising than confidence would be." "How so?" "Because confidence is often just another wall. Uncertainty means you're actually present." She unlocked the Volvo, then paused with her hand on the door. "One more thing. Whatever you decide to do about Preston and Charlotte, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Not because you're angry, not because you want revenge, but because it's actually necessary. Anger makes terrible decisions." Before Nate could respond, she'd leaned in and kissed him, brief, definitive, the kind of kiss that served as punctuation rather than question. Then she was in the car engine, starting taillights, disappearing into North End traffic. Nate stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, processing the evening through filters that didn't quite have categories for what had just happened. His phone buzzed with accumulated messages. Franklin with updates on the medical board response, Margaret with tomorrow's schedule, Grace with probably well-meaning advice he didn't need. He ignored all of it, choosing instead to walk back through the North End toward where Bernard waited with the Bentley. The walk took 20 minutes, plenty of time to think about walls and tests and the difference between safety and isolation. Rebecca was right. He'd built his entire post-Abigail life around avoiding risk, which meant he'd also avoided possibility. Charlotte had been less a relationship than an experiment, and when she'd failed, he'd felt vindicated rather than disappointed. But vindication was cold comfort when it meant being right and alone. Bernard saw him coming and had the door open before Nate reached the car. The drive back to Commonwealth Avenue took them through late-evening Boston, the city quieter now that dinner crowds had scattered and clubs hadn't quite filled. Nate watched the streets scroll past and thought about Rebecca's question. What was he going to do about Preston and Charlotte? The rational answer remained unchanged. Let the attorneys handle it. Stay above the fray. Maintain dignity while the process ground toward inevitable dismissal. But something Rebecca had said kept circling back. Sometimes the high road is just another way of letting terrible people win by default. His phone rang. Unknown number again, and Nate was getting tired of unknown numbers delivering complications. He answered anyway. Nathaniel Sterling. The voice was female, young, nervous, in a way that suggested intern or paralegal. "Mr. Sterling, this is Jennifer Moss from the Boston Globe. I'm working on a story about the medical board complaint filed against you today. Do you have any comment?" "No comment. Direct all media inquiries to Whitmore and Associates." Sir, I've already spoken with them, but I wanted to give you a chance to respond to some additional allegations that have come to light. Nate felt warning signals activate. What additional allegations? We've received documents suggesting Sterling Medical billed Medicare for services that were never rendered at your Dorchester facility between 2019 and 2021. The complaint alleges systematic fraud totaling $4.3 million. Can you confirm or deny these allegations? The accusation landed like physical impact. Medicare fraud was federal crime territory, the kind of allegation that triggered FBI investigations and Senate hearings. It was also complete fiction. Sterling Medical's billing was audited quarterly by external firms, specifically to prevent even the appearance of impropriety. His voice went cold. Those allegations are false. Sterling Medical's billing practices are audited by independent firms and reviewed by federal regulators annually. We've never received a single citation for billing irregularities. So you're denying any knowledge of fraudulent billing? I'm stating a fact. It didn't happen. Where did you get these documents? I can't reveal my sources, but they were provided by individuals with direct knowledge of Sterling Medical's operations. Jennifer's voice carried the barely suppressed excitement of a reporter who thought she'd found her Pulitzer. Will you agree to an interview? I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell your side before we publish. When does the story run? Tomorrow morning, front page. Nate's mind moved through implications with the speed of someone who'd spent decades managing crises. The headline would hit before he could mount a proper defense. The medical board complaint would seem suddenly credible. The Nashville expansion would face immediate pushback, and every relationship Sterling Medical had cultivated would be strained by the need to distance from potential federal investigation. Preston and Charlotte hadn't just filed nuisance complaints. They'd manufactured evidence designed to trigger the kind of scrutiny that destroyed companies regardless of guilt. Into the phone, Ms. Moss. I strongly suggest you verify those documents' authenticity before publication. If they're falsified, and I'm telling you they are, the Globe will be party to libel and defamation. My attorneys will be in touch. He ended the call and immediately dialed Franklin. We've got a problem. The Globe's running a Medicare fraud story tomorrow morning based on documents alleging $4.3 million in false billing. The documents are fake, but they're good enough that a reporter bought them. Franklin's response was immediate. Injunction. We filed tonight for emergency injunction preventing publication pending verification. Judge Rothman owes me a favor. I can get her on the phone within the hour. Do it. And Franklin, find out where those documents came from. Someone inside Sterling Medical either provided them or had access to create convincing forgeries. That's not Preston and Charlotte working alone anymore. That's conspiracy. The Bentley pulled up to his building. Nate stepped out into air that had finally made good on its promise, snow falling and fat flakes that melted on contact with pavement still holding the day's heat. He rode the elevator to his penthouse, thinking about walls and isolation and the distance between dignity and capitulation. Margaret had left files on his desk, the crisis management proposals he'd already decided on, contracts requiring signature, the daily accumulation of running an empire. But Nate moved past all of it, heading instead to the windows overlooking Boston Harbor. The city glittered below all those individual lights, representing lives being lived without the complications he'd invited through his choices. His phone buzzed. Grace texting instead of calling. I heard about the Globe story. Please tell me you're lawyering up and not trying to handle this yourself. He typed back, Franklin's filing for injunction. Documents are fraudulent, someone's manufacturing evidence. Her response came immediately. Dad, this is serious. Medicare fraud allegations are career-ending even when false. You need to go nuclear on whoever's behind this. Nate stared at the message, thinking about Rebecca's advice to fight back Grace's instinct to go nuclear and his own decades-long practice of maintaining dignity while others played dirty. The rational response remained clear: let the legal system work, trust the process, maintain professional distance. But standing in his penthouse watching snow fall over a city that was preparing to read manufactured accusations over morning coffee, Nate felt something shift. Not anger exactly, something colder and more purposeful, the decision to stop playing defense and start asking why defense had become necessary in the first place. He called Franklin back. In addition to the injunction, I want you to file criminal complaints against Preston Whitmore and Charlotte Ashford for fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of process. I want subpoenas for their phone records, emails, financial transactions, and I want a forensic team examining those Medicare documents to trace their origin." Franklin went quiet for a moment, the silence of an attorney recalculating strategy. "Nate, that's escalation. Once you file criminal complaints, this becomes war. Are you sure that's what you want?" "I'm sure that I'm done being the only party following rules while everyone else treats them as suggestions." Nate's reflection stared back from the window, distorted by snow and distance. "They wanted to make this about my character, fine. Let's examine theirs under oath and see how well it holds up. This is going to get ugly. It was already ugly. Now it's just going to be honest about what it is." He ended the call and stood there watching the city, thinking about tests and walls and the moment when self-protection becomes self-imprisonment. Rebecca had asked what he was going to do. Grace had told him to go nuclear. His own instincts screamed to maintain dignity and distance. But dignity hadn't protected him from Charlotte's contempt. Distance hadn't prevented Preston's vendetta. And maintaining walls had left him alone at the top of an empire that was supposed to mean something but mostly just meant he'd successfully insulated himself from everyone who might actually matter. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating in corners where pavement met building, beginning the slow transformation of the city into something cleaner and simpler. Nate pulled out his phone and typed a message to Rebecca. "You were right. I'm fighting back. Not because I'm angry, but because letting terrible people win by default isn't dignity. It's cowardice. Thank you for dinner. Thursday." Her response came back almost immediately. "Thursday works. Fair warning, if you're actually fighting back, I'm going to help. Surgeons are excellent at identifying where to cut. See you then." Nate smiled despite himself. Despite the Medicare fraud allegations waiting to explode tomorrow morning, despite the medical board complaint and the board members questioning his judgment, and the entire accumulated weight of consequences from 3 years of testing someone who'd never been worth testing in the first place. He had 4 days until Thursday. 4 days to dismantle the conspiracy that Preston and Charlotte had built to prove the Medicare documents were fabricated, to demonstrate that fighting back didn't require sacrificing principles, just recognizing that principles without action were indistinguishable from cowardice. The snow continued falling, covering Boston in white that wouldn't last past morning but looked beautiful while it lasted. And Nathaniel Sterling, standing alone in his penthouse watching the city transform, decided that maybe walls weren't strength after all. Maybe strength was knowing when to tear them down.